congenial to the foreign policy establishment. Linkage. On February 4, 1969, he sent a letter to Secretary of State William Rogers and Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, emphasizing the new administration's approach. 15. Its essence was a dramatic move away from the previous administration's tendency to compartmentalize seemingly disparate issues. I recognize that the previous administration took the view that when we perceive a mutual interest on an issue with the USSR, we should pursue agreement and attempt to insulate it as much as possible from the ups and downs of conflicts elsewhere. This may well be sound on numerous bilateral and practical matters such as cultural or scientific exchanges. But, on the crucial issues of our day, I believe we must seek to advance on a front at least broad enough to make clear that we see some relationship between political and military issues. The memorandum elicited unease, to put it mildly, among advocates of the prevailing view, which was to negotiate on issues as they emerged to prevent them from contaminating realms of potential cooperation. Such an approach mirrored the government's departmental structure in which disparate departments and offices lobby for their preferred line of effort. Nixon recognized that such segmentation ran the risk at that period of enabling the Soviet Union to prescribe the agenda and use negotiations as a cover to advance its imperial aims. In the end, Nixon's approach powerfully altered the Soviet calculus. 3 weeks after the announcement on July 15, 1971 of Nixon's intention to visit to China, he was invited to a summit in Moscow. In May 1972, only 3 weeks after he had ordered the bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of Haiphong Harbor, and 3 months after the summit in Beijing, a week-long U.S.-Soviet summit in Moscow would demonstrate the Soviet Union's eagerness to stabilize relations with America. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT-I, the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM, Treaty and the Incidents at Sea Agreement were signed by Nixon and Brezhnev during that summit as steps toward the goal Nixon put forward in his first inaugural address, strengthening the structure of peace. The 1974 Threshold Test Ban Treaty continued the process, as did the 1975 Helsinki Accords, which were agreed during the succeeding Gerald Ford administration. These agreements highlighted another term, détente, that came to be associated with Nixon's foreign policy and evoked controversy. Derived from the French infinitive détendre, to loosen, and therefore shrouded in inscrutable implications, it implied a relaxation of tensions among the superpowers. The primary objection to it was the contention that American diplomacy should focus on undermining and eventually destroying the Soviet system and those of other adversaries. Contrarily, Nixon and I argued that declaring overthrow of the entire system as the defining objective would overshadow every controversy, with the risk of an ultimate confrontation in an age of weapons of mass destruction and revolutionary technology in other fields. Instead, we favored a strong military position coupled with a diplomacy that achieved the defense of American strategic interests via multiple options. Another purpose of détente was to give the Soviets a stake in key aspects of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Relations were to be fostered when Soviet conduct was responsible and reduced or modified in periods of stress. The approaches of strength and of diplomacy were kept on the table simultaneously and executed as part of the same strategy. As we shall see, the United States responded strongly to high-risk challenges, posing a maximum incentive for restraint by the other side, as in the Jordan Crisis of 1970, the South Asia conflict of 1971 and the Middle East War of 1973. At the same time, it always kept open a vision of coexistence with adversaries. A trip to Europe. Nixon's first foreign trip as president took place a month after his inauguration, from February 23 to March 2, 1969. The proclaimed purpose was to restore a new spirit of cooperation, after differences over Vietnam and Middle East policy had strained America's relationship with its European allies. But the trip's elevated purpose ran up against the complexities of Europe's growing quest for a new identity. While the continent had substantially recovered economically from the ravages of the Second World War, it was still only beginning the process of creating common institutions and remained far from its avowed goal of devising a common geopolitical strategy. For 4 centuries, Europeans' military prowess and contributions to political philosophy had shaped the world. Now, however, the nations of Europe, above all, feared Soviet pressures backed by military force. As a result, although the Allies considered American military support via NATO indispensable, they were also moving to gain greater autonomy in shaping their political and, especially, economic future. Nixon's first venture into foreign policy had been as a congressman on the 1947 Herter Committee, a forerunner of the 1948 Marshall Plan. The committee's fall 1947 trip to Europe helped shape Nixon's lasting commitment to an organic link between America and the continent. At that time, Europe was eager for a deeper American connection. A quarter-century later, when Nixon became president, European leaders were still preoccupied with the continent's internal evolution, while only nominally committed to enhancing their political partnership with the U.S. To complicate matters, within a year of Nixon's visit, every major European government would be replaced for domestic reasons. 2 months later, Charles de Gaulle, who had twice vetoed British membership in the European Community, the predecessor of the EU, retired and was succeeded by Georges Pompidou. Likewise, Chancellor Kurt George Kiesinger, our host in Germany, who basically followed the Adenauer course, would be replaced before the year was out by Willy Brandt, who would adopt a more flexible policy toward the Soviet Union under the aegis of Ostpolitik. Prime Minister Harold Wilson, our British host, would lose an election to the Conservative leader Edward Heath, who would seek to put distance between London and Washington by giving greater priority to securing membership in a united Europe than to fostering the UK's established ties with America. Nixon therefore found himself on a journey to convey America's long-term reassurances to a group of leaders focused on their domestic political horizons. Nor were these the only ironies attending his 8-day visit. Even as his hosts encouraged him to initiate talks on nuclear arms control with the Soviet Union, and on ending the Vietnam War, they grew uneasy when he accepted their recommendations on a broad basis. In due course, and with proper preparation, the United States will enter into negotiations with the Soviet Union on a wide range of issues. Nixon stated during remarks at NATO headquarters in Brussels, acknowledging that such talks will affect our European allies, though they would be conducted by the United States on its own. With that in mind, he stressed the importance of maintaining cooperation and unity. We will do so on the basis of full consultation and cooperation with our allies, because we recognize that the chances for successful negotiations depend on our unity. The address generated ambivalence. European allies welcomed support against the Soviet threat yet remained uneasy about what U.S.-Soviet negotiations might actually entail. Nixon's purported intention of injecting diplomatic fluidity into a frozen international situation produced a mixture of approval and anxiety, while his call for a genuine consultation with the Allies before the fact raised questions about the alliance's cohesiveness that have continued into our present moment. The U.S. relationship with Europe under Nixon evolved at a cooperative, consultative level, and Nixon's personal commitment to NATO was pervasive. Still deeper structural issues were explored but not resolved. What degree of cooperation was needed outside the treaty area, for example in the Middle East or Asia? How much unity did the alliance need amidst a fragmenting world and an exploding technology? How much diversity could it stand? Part of the ambivalence can be ascribed to the Vietnam War, which European leaders generally perceived as a diversion from their own central security interests. Differential assessments of global risk between America and Europe created further challenges, such as the German Ostpolitik, which advocated a forward political approach to the Soviet Union. A significant transformation of Atlantic relations occurred during the third year of the Nixon presidency in the economic field. The 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement had established fixed exchange rates between foreign currencies and the dollar and allowed governments to exchange dollars for gold at $35 per ounce. It had worked well for 2 decades, but by the late 1960s was coming under increasing strain. As Western Europe and Japan recovered from the Second World War, they accumulated dollar reserves, $40 billion by 1971, compared with U.S. gold reserves worth $10 billion. Lacking confidence in the U.S. ability to sustain gold convertibility, foreign governments, led by France, demanded that ever more dollars be exchanged for gold. Nixon reacted with characteristic decisiveness. Over 3 days at Camp David in August 1971, he conferred with his economic advisors. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns sought to preserve the Bretton Woods system, while Treasury Secretary John Connally and Office of Management and Budget Director George Shultz favored an end to the dollar-gold link, with Shultz going so far as to propose a new system of floating exchange rates. Siding with Connally and Shultz, Nixon judged that dollar-gold convertibility could not be preserved and that any attempt to maintain it would invite speculative attacks on the dollar. He announced a temporary suspension of dollar convertibility to gold on Sunday, August 15. Both this decision and the unilateral manner in which it was made unsettled some allies. France was strongly opposed to the suspension of the link. French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, later to become president, worried that, without the tether of the link, American economic inflation might spread throughout the global financial system. On its part, West Germany was concerned that the sudden and unilateral change heralded a resurgence of economic nationalism. To assuage these anxieties and develop the outlines of a new long-term monetary arrangement, Undersecretary of the Treasury Paul Volcker met with European counterparts. These efforts culminated in the Smithsonian Agreement of December 1971, which devalued the dollar and established new exchange rates. But fixed exchange rates proved difficult to sustain without the gold standard, and the agreement fell apart by February 1973, leading the major economies to adopt floating exchange rates. Despite initial fears, the system still endures. Nixon's dramatic decisions at Camp David shifted the global monetary order to a more flexible, but ultimately more sustainable, equilibrium. In 1973, Nixon responded to the continuing debates over the monetary system as well as the European uneasiness about nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War by proposing the Year of Europe. This involved a declaration of long-term partnership between Europe and the United States following the then-approaching conclusion of the Vietnam War. In a speech delivered in New York in April 1973, I proposed, on behalf of Nixon, that the U.S. and its European partners reach by the end of the year a statement of common purposes in both political and strategic fields, modeled on the Atlantic Charter signed by Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill on August 14, 1941. The purpose was to bring the common security efforts up to date with technological development and to define common political purposes, in light of the evolution of the crisis in different parts of the world. The proposal proved premature. Our allies were receptive to a restatement of strategic goals that involved their immediate security, but resisted global definitions of transatlantic political unity. Nixon supported the NATO structure, vigorously defended the freedom of Berlin, and achieved an enhanced status for that city, which put an end to more than a decade of crisis and threats to Berlin access. He also maintained a continuous political dialogue with NATO and the principal leaders of Europe. After his presidency, U.S. initiatives outside the NATO area, as in counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan or Iraq, for example, received European support, but more in order to maintain the American commitment to European defense against Russia than to express a common global purpose. Nixon's ultimate goal of an organic relationship with Europe on global issues has therefore remained on the agenda to this day. The Vietnam War and its conclusion. By the time Nixon took office, the U.S. had been involved in Vietnam for nearly 2 decades. As he was being inaugurated in January 1969, 30,000 American servicemen had already died in battle, and multiple anti-war protests, some of them violent, had taken place all over the country. At my first meeting with Nixon after the election at the Pierre Hotel, he emphasized that he was determined to end the war in Vietnam during his first term. He vowed to the families of fallen servicemen an outcome compatible with America's honor. He would seek to achieve it by a diplomacy of linkage with the Soviet Union. Conceivably, his idea of an opening to China would also play a role. But he would not sell out. The security of free peoples, as well as international peace and progress, depended on restoring and eventually renewing American leadership. Military and political efforts had to remain concurrent. The U.S. had joined the defense of South Vietnam against communist insurgents by sending military advisors, as early as the presidency of Harry Truman. Eisenhower increased American aid and augmented the number of military advisors attached to the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, from 35 to nearly 700 by 1956. Toward the end of his presidency, Eisenhower concluded that new supply routes being opened by North Vietnamese encroachment into Laos and Cambodia, 2 weak and neutral countries bordering South Vietnam, were progressively threatening the safety of Saigon and needed to be resisted. This supply system, later dubbed the Ho Chi Minh Trail, stretched through rugged jungles along South Vietnam's 600-mile-long western border, rendering it difficult to discover, target or intercept. It had become the linchpin of the North Vietnamese strategy to undermine and ultimately overthrow the South Vietnamese government. During the presidential transition of 1960, Eisenhower advised his successor, John F. Kennedy, to deploy American combat forces in the region and, if necessary, resist incursions into the neutral border countries. Kennedy did not immediately act on Eisenhower's advice, seeking instead a political solution via negotiation with Hanoi. The outcome was the 1962 International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos. But when Hanoi later violated Laotian neutrality through increased infiltration, Kennedy responded by assigning 15,000 American troops to train and advise South Vietnamese combat units. Believing South Vietnam's autocratic ruler, Ngo Dinh Diem, lacked broad support and the political will to win, the Kennedy administration encouraged the country's military to replace him. That coup, which led to Diem's assassination on November 2, 1963, hollowed out the South Vietnamese government amidst a civil war in which, by definition, the besieged government is the principal prize. The North Vietnamese used this opportunity to introduce regular combat units to reinforce their guerrilla forces. After Kennedy's assassination on November 22, 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson escalated U.S. military efforts in Vietnam on the advice of the National Security Team he had inherited from Kennedy, the sole dissenter being George Ball, the Undersecretary of State. Johnson would soon realize, however, that the political ambiguities in the region were compounded by the complexity of devising a military strategy. The sheer scale of the U.S. deployment to so distant a location created an imperative for America to end the war quickly. But Hanoi's strategy was to protract the conflict so as to exhaust the Americans psychologically. In a contest between a mechanized army and jungle-based guerrilla forces, the latter enjoy the advantage, in that they win as long as they do not lose. By January 1969, North Vietnam had consolidated the western third of Laos and portions of Cambodia out of reach of American power as bases, through which it sent most of its supplies to South Vietnam, imperiling the southernmost portion of South Vietnam, including Saigon. It was thus in a logistical position to test American domestic endurance by applying a strategy which North Vietnamese Premier Pham Van Dong had told New York Times correspondent Harrison Salisbury was based on the belief that the North Vietnamese were more profoundly committed to Vietnam than the Americans, in essence, that more Vietnamese would be prepared to die for Vietnam than would Americans. Deadlock on the battlefield and growing casualties created a civic fracturing on the American home front. It began on college campuses during the Johnson administration as a debate over objectives and feasibilities. By the time Nixon took his oath of office, it had exploded into a confrontation over the relationship between American values and American methods. Was the war just? If it was unjust, would it not be better to abandon the entire enterprise? While the latter position was initially considered radical, it soon became the conventional wisdom among broad swaths of the American elite. American exceptionalism was turned on its head, the righteous idealism that had inspired and sustained the country's post-Second World War assumption of international responsibilities was now, in light of Vietnam, invoked in wholesale repudiation of America's global role. The crisis of faith ignited by Vietnam extended well beyond the war to the very character and essence of American purposes. As college teach-ins dissolved into mass demonstrations, a point was reached where, in the election year of 1968, President Johnson was precluded from making public appearances except on military bases. Nonetheless, unilateral withdrawal from the war remained unpopular with the general public, and both Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic presidential nominee, and his Republican opponent, Richard Nixon, rejected unilateral withdrawal but campaigned on the promise that they would seek a way to end the war by negotiation. Nixon was not explicit about the method except to say that it would be a new approach. The Democratic protest platform spoke of withdrawals without specificity. The issue that split the Democratic Party and produced riots at its presidential convention in August was over a plank urging the mutual withdrawal of both American and North Vietnamese military forces from South Vietnam. The size of the proposed American withdrawal, as envisaged by Senator Edward E. Ted Kennedy and other dovish Democrats, was specified only as of a significant number. From our first meeting, Nixon had insisted on an honorable outcome in Vietnam as a component of American world leadership. During the transition period after the election, we defined honorable as giving the people of Indochina, who had fought for freedom, an opportunity to determine their own fate. By then, the domestic protest had moved to urging unilateral withdrawal. Nixon adamantly rejected this. In his view, the national interest required navigating between victory and retreat. Unconditional retreat, in Nixon's view, was the road to spiritual and geopolitical abdication, in other words, a severe impairment of American relevance to international order. Once inaugurated, Nixon discovered practical reasons for rejecting unilateral withdrawal. The Joint Chiefs of Staff estimated that it would take 16 months to prepare for the removal of 500,000 troops and their equipment, even allowing that the chiefs' estimate was affected by their dislike of the idea altogether. The chaotic experience of removing 5,000 American troops from Afghanistan in 2021 demonstrates the potential disorder of unilateral withdrawal in war conditions. In Vietnam in 1969, American forces of over 150,000 faced at least 800,000 North Vietnamese, and a comparable number of South Vietnamese whose conduct, if they felt betrayed, might range from hostility to panic. Therefore Nixon, as he had said during the campaign, resolved to implement a diplomacy via linkage with the Soviet Union. He pursued this strategy even in the face of a North Vietnamese offensive that began within 3 weeks of Nixon's inauguration, before he had made any major military move, leading to more than 6,000 American fatalities during the first 6 months of his presidency. Nixon sought by a combination of diplomacy and pressure to induce Moscow to cut off its support for Hanoi. My staff produced an exploratory diplomatic plan whereby we would submit the concessions we were prepared to make to the North Vietnamese, possibly via Moscow. Concurrently, they also developed options for military escalation, essentially consisting of a blockade and the resumption of bombing, under the code name Duck Hook. If our offer were rejected by Moscow, Nixon would seek to impose it by military force. As it happened, the military portions would be largely implemented 3 years later, in May 1972, in response to Hanoi's all-out Easter offensive. Cyrus Vance, who had negotiated with North Vietnam for the Johnson administration, seemed receptive to the idea of being appointed special negotiator in the event that our proposal gained favor. With Nixon's approval, I put the concept, without details, to Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States. We never received an answer from Moscow, but in an August 1969 meeting, my first with the North Vietnamese, Deputy Foreign Minister Xuyen Thuy volunteered his awareness of the proposal by rejecting it on the ground that Hanoi would never negotiate through a third party. While the diplomatic track was being considered, Nixon put before the world a comprehensive strategic concept for Southeast Asia on July 25, 1969. For the site of his address, he chose the unlikely location of the western Pacific island of Guam during an afternoon stop on an around-the-world trip, shortly after greeting the American astronauts who had just returned from the moon. In a seemingly extemporaneous statement at a press conference, in fact carefully prepared at the White House and refined en route, Nixon presented his Southeast Asia policy as a way of emphasizing American relationships with regional partners. Invoking the dangers posed by Communist China, North Korea, and North Vietnam, Nixon proceeded to argue that the United States must avoid the kind of policy that had made countries in Asia so dependent on us that we are dragged into conflicts such as the one we have in Vietnam. The traveling press inevitably asked for more detail, which Nixon had come prepared to supply. He responded, "I believe that the time has come when the United States, in our relations with all of our Asian friends, should be quite emphatic on 2 points. 1. That we will keep our treaty commitments, but, 2. That as far as the problems of internal security are concerned, as far as the problems of military defense, except for the threat of a major power involving nuclear weapons, that the United States is going to encourage and has the right to expect that this problem will be increasingly handled by, and the responsibility for it taken by, the Asian nations themselves. What came to be known as the Nixon Doctrine contained three essential principles. The United States would keep all of its treaty commitments. It would provide a shield if a nuclear power threatened the freedom of a nation allied with us, or of a nation whose survival the United States considered vital to our security and the security of the region as a whole. In cases involving other types of aggression, that is, conventional aggression by non-nuclear powers, the U.S. would furnish military and economic assistance when requested. But it would look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for its defense. Under Vietnamization, as it came to be called, the U.S. would by the third of these principles provide military equipment and training as well as continued air support, to enable Saigon to hold on until it was strong enough to defend itself alone. The purpose of the Nixon Doctrine was to demonstrate American resolve and evoke sufficient South Vietnamese capability to enable Hanoi to agree to a political outcome that would permit the people of South Vietnam to determine their own future. Nixon pledged to keep American commitments to treaty allies, such as South Korea and Thailand, but also to defend other nations in Asia that were threatened by nuclear powers, implicitly China and the Soviet Union. Where he departed from his predecessors was in tying the level of American assistance to the threatened nation's assumption of responsibility for their own defense. An underlying purpose was to reassure countries that had based their survival on faith in America's role that negotiations to end the war in Vietnam would not mark a strategic retreat from Asia. Meanwhile, a formal negotiation with North Vietnam had been established at the very end of Johnson's presidency and continued during Nixon's. Under it, representatives of Hanoi, the U.S., the Saigon administration and the South Vietnamese National Liberation Front would meet for weekly sessions at the Hotel Majestic, in Paris. Hanoi never regarded these talks as part of a diplomatic process, but rather as another stage in its psychological strategy to undermine American will and overthrow the illegitimate South Vietnamese government. In these negotiations, which had been announced with so much hope by President Johnson in the last days of the 1968 presidential campaign, Hanoi's objective was twofold, with respect to the government of South Vietnam, to delegitimize it by first refusing to deal with it at all, then insisting that the Communist National Liberation Front be the South Vietnamese negotiating partner. After a compromise enabling both of the South Vietnamese claimants to legitimacy to join the formal negotiations, Hanoi refused to discuss any substantive issues at all. Its objective remained to procrastinate until exhaustion or domestic discord would force the United States to abandon its South Vietnamese ally. The official forum at the Hotel Majestic, where the North Vietnamese were led by Xuyen Thuy, achieved the unusual feat that in 4 years of so-called negotiations it made no progress whatever, leaving behind only a succession of empty formal statements. By the summer of 1969, Nixon had explored the Moscow Channel to achieve what we considered an honorable outcome. But before adopting the option of increasing pressure, he decided to make another effort to jumpstart negotiations. It had 2 parts, detaching me from an around-the-world trip to meet in Paris on August 4, 1969 with Xuyen Thuy. This was a first clandestine meeting, which by the following April had become a secret channel between Le Duc Tho and me. France was the only NATO country to maintain diplomatic relations with Hanoi, and the meeting had been arranged by Jean Saintony, the French ambassador to Hanoi. Saintony's wife had become a personal friend after spending 3 months at the international seminar I taught at Harvard's summer school. As a result, the first secret meeting between the Nixon White House and Vietnamese officials took place in Saintony's elegant apartment on the Rue de Rivoli. He introduced us to the Vietnamese with the injunction not to break any furniture. A discussion followed that previewed the next 3 years of deadlock. Xuyen Thuy delivered a discourse on the epic nature of the Vietnamese struggle for independence and Hanoi's determination to pursue it to the end. I would hear repetitions countless times over the coming years, concluding with a statement of Hanoi's preconditions. I, in turn, explained our willingness to negotiate on the basis of a political process in which all groups, including the communists, could participate. Nixon had instructed me to use the occasion for a bold step. I was to convey that if we received no meaningful response to our proposal in either negotiating channel by November 1st, we would have to consider other than diplomatic measures, implying military force. Xuyen Thuy, who like all Vietnamese negotiators I encountered conducted himself with impeccable courtesy, responded by repeating Hanoi's preconditions: withdrawal of all American forces and overthrow of the Saigon government before any meaningful negotiations. Since Nixon had no intention to discuss such terms, he decided to repeat the ultimatum to Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin at the White House on October 20th. Pulling a yellow legal pad from his desk in the Oval Office, Nixon handed it to the ambassador, saying, "You'd better take some notes." 31. Dobrynin asked clarifying questions and pleaded ignorance as to the substance. To underscore the deadline to Moscow and Hanoi, Nixon went so far as to schedule a speech on Vietnam for November 3, emphasizing the deadline. It turned out to be one of his most eloquent. Defying protests that had paralyzed Washington for weeks, Nixon appealed to the great silent majority in America to stand fast for an honorable peace. Let historians not record that when America was the most powerful nation in the world, we passed on the other side of the road and allowed the last hopes for peace and freedom of millions of people to be suffocated by the forces of totalitarianism. And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. But now, for the only time in my association with Nixon, he stepped back from a course he had proclaimed. As we were approaching the November deadline without a Hanoi change in attitude or presidential decision of consequence, I wrote 2 memoranda on the principle that the security advisor owes the president an analysis of matters of consequential decisions. The first memorandum inquired whether Vietnamization could in fact achieve our agreed objectives. The second memorandum a day later analyzed the incentives for a diplomatic solution in the existing strategy. Nixon decided to stay his de facto course, avoiding the military escalation he had threatened and for which his staff was preparing, but also the unilateral withdrawal demanded by Hanoi and the domestic protesters. He essentially opted for the Vietnamization process that he had outlined in his Guam press conference. In his November 3 speech, he would describe his strategy as a progressive withdrawal of U.S. troops while negotiations continued, holding on until Saigon was strong enough for a political outcome that would permit the people of South Vietnam to determine their own fate. Vietnamization as developed by Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, and announced by Nixon, involved a process of gradual withdrawal of American forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese troops. By the time of the speech, the withdrawal of some 100,000 U.S. forces was already being implemented. At the time, I was uneasy with Nixon's decision. Over the years, In reflecting on the alternatives, I have concluded that Nixon had chosen the wiser course. Had he followed his first instincts, he would have had a cabinet crisis, compounded by national paralysis from protest demonstrations in major cities. The opening to China was still only an idea. The first reply from Beijing had not yet been received. The Soviet Union had not yet been faced down in the Middle East or over Berlin, and negotiations with it were still in an exploratory stage. Also, earlier in that crucial year, our European allies had displayed their distaste for war in Southeast Asia during Nixon's trip to Europe. So, despite my initial reservations, I implemented Nixon's decision in the years to come with conviction. Both Nixon and I were convinced that the stability of the evolving international structure had to be buttressed by American strategic credibility, not squandered, especially when it came to China and Russia. The scorn of the elites notwithstanding, Nixon strove to deliver on his promises to America's silent majority, both to avoid a humiliating defeat in Vietnam and to cease sending their sons into inconclusive combat. Whether these objectives were compatible was at the heart of an ongoing national debate, prompting constraints imposed by an atmosphere of upheaval on campuses and in the streets as well as constant reflection in Nixon's entourage. As for Hanoi, it had not fought for decades against both France and America for the sake of a political process or a negotiated compromise, but to achieve a total political victory. To explore every avenue of negotiations, Nixon now resumed secret political talks with Hanoi. Hanoi would send its chief negotiator and Politburo member Lu Ductho to Paris, where I would connect with him every 3 months or so. But these meetings were substantive only in comparison with the formal negotiations and, even then, not significantly. In each session, Lu Ductho would read a statement listing alleged American transgressions against Vietnam. Hanoi's minimum and maximum terms remained identical: that the Saigon government be replaced by peace-loving personalities and all American troops be withdrawn as a prelude to negotiations. When we explored his definition of peace-loving, it turned out that no established South Vietnamese political figure met his criteria. Nixon did not budge. 2 years later, on January 25, 1972, to the amazement of the media, which had long accused him of neglecting the peace process, he published the record of my 2 years of secret negotiations with Lu Ductho. In a speech that same evening, he put forward what was essentially a final offer, combining a ceasefire, South Vietnamese self-government and American withdrawal, the strategy quietly adopted since the November 3, 1969 speech. Hanoi's response was to launch, on March 30, 1972, its Easter Offensive against South Vietnam, deploying all but one of its combat divisions, during which it took a provincial capital, Quang Tri, for the first time since Nixon's inauguration. It must have calculated that America would not risk a summit scheduled for Moscow in May amidst military escalation, during an election year. By this stage, however, we were closing in on our objectives with Vietnamization. By the end of 1971, all combat units had been withdrawn. By the end of 1972, there would be fewer than 25,000 American troops remaining in the country, down from more than 500,000 on the day Nixon took office. South Vietnamese ground forces, with American air support, were now conducting the entire battle repelling Hanoi's latest offensive. American fatalities had fallen dramatically from 16,899 in 1968, to 2,414 in 1971, to 68 in 1973, when the U.S. withdrew its remaining troops after the Paris Peace Accords. The timing of the Easter offensive had heightened the stakes of any action Nixon might take in response. His state visit to China had been a historic first step in transforming the Cold War. The Moscow summit meetings in late May would be another landmark event. The consensus in Washington advocated military restraint. Just as predictably, Nixon rejected that approach. During an NSC meeting at the White House on the morning of May 8, 1972, the president acknowledged that escalatory retaliation could jeopardize the Moscow summit and the months of preparatory work that had gone into it. But doing nothing or being driven out of Vietnam ensured that we would enter negotiations with Moscow with a record of national abdication. Addressing the nation in this spirit, Nixon laid out the American position, in essence, a reiteration of the peace offer he had made in January, a ceasefire and withdrawal of U.S. troops in return for Hanoi accepting a Saigon government, assembled through an agreed-upon political process. Nixon explained, "There are only two issues left for us in this war. First, in the face of a massive invasion, do we stand by, jeopardize the lives of 60,000 Americans, including civilian staffs, and leave the South Vietnamese to a long night of terror? This will not happen. We shall do whatever is required to safeguard American lives and American honor. Second, in the face of complete intransigence at the conference table, do we join with our enemy to install a communist government in South Vietnam? This, too, will not happen. We will not cross the line from generosity to treachery." Following the maxim he frequently enunciated, that one pays the same price for doing something half-heartedly as for doing it completely, Nixon now ordered the package of measures originally designed in 1969, including the mining of the North's harbors and bombing of its supply lines wherever they were located, thereby abrogating the bombing halt agreement in effect since 1968. Moscow opted to ignore the challenge, and the summit took place as scheduled. While the Soviets condemned the escalation as well as the blockade, they confined their critique to one dinner at Brezhnev's dacha, issuing no threats and ending with Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and me resuming the SALT discussions that same evening. Shortly after the summit, the titular Soviet head of state, Nikolai Podgorny, visited Hanoi. No retaliatory actions were taken. Moscow had concluded that it could not abandon its efforts to balance our China initiative. In July, our South Vietnamese allies recaptured Quang Tri. Hanoi was becoming isolated. Neither the Soviet Union nor China came to its aid, other than by public protest. That same month, negotiations with Lu Duc-tho resumed. While his formal positions remained unchanged, his tone had become somewhat more conciliatory. He raised questions exploring the speed with which a final agreement might be negotiated, assuming we made a breakthrough. Then, during a meeting on October 8, he suddenly introduced a formal document that he described as an acceptance by Hanoi of Nixon's final offer of January, stating, "This new proposal is exactly what President Nixon has himself proposed: ceasefire, end of the war, release of the prisoners, and troop withdrawal." That was essentially accurate, though many traps would emerge in the negotiations. Still, the acceptance of the Saigon government as a continuing structure did meet one of our principal objectives. When though finished, I asked for a recess. After he left the room, I turned to Winston Lord, my friend and special assistant, shook his hand, and said, "We may have done it." Asterisk. Having procrastinated for nearly 3 years, Lu Duc-tho behaved very differently now that Hanoi was eager to conclude negotiations before the looming U.S. presidential election, after which it feared it might have to deal with a president re-elected by an overwhelming majority. Nixon was aware that in his second term he was likely to face a hostile Congress, even now in the process of cutting off funding for the war effort. For a short moment, strategic calculations on both sides became parallel. The conflict had finally reached what scholars of negotiated settlements call ripeness. As a result, Leduc and I spent 3 days and nights drafting a final text, subject to approval by Nixon and Saigon. Peace was tantalizingly close, with Hanoi pressing us to conclude our work immediately. But neither Nixon nor I would end the war by imposing it on a people who had fought at our side for 20 years. And Saigon, aware that its struggle for survival would not end with a peace agreement, insisted on prolonged negotiations over details, in the process proving that the capacity for endurance was not confined to the North. But Saigon's procrastination had in fact a deeper meaning: the fear of being left alone with a determined enemy for whom the word peace had only a tactical significance. The situation was now exactly the reverse of what it had been through nearly all of Nixon's first term. Hanoi, pressing us to conclude an agreement it had evaded for a decade and to commit us to what we had discussed, published the entire text of where the negotiations stood. At a press conference on October 26, 1972, I explained the status of the negotiations, emphasizing that we remained committed to the negotiated endgame, which I introduced, with Nixon's approval, by using the phrase, "Peace is at hand." I ended with a paragraph designed to reflect both our urgency and our limits. We will not be stampeded into an agreement until its provisions are right. We will not be deflected from an agreement when its provisions are right. And with this attitude and with some cooperation from the other side, we believe that we can restore both peace and unity to America very soon. After Nixon's re-election on November 7, Leduc, now judging time to be on his side, returned to his breakthrough stalling tactics. By early December, Nixon concluded that Hanoi was trying to prolong talks into his second term and ordered an air campaign against military targets by B-52 bombers. It was widely criticized in the media, by Congress and internationally. But, 2 weeks later, Hanoi returned to the negotiations and agreed to modifications requested by Saigon. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. They included the principal terms Nixon had put forward a year earlier. 9 nations, as well as the governments of Saigon and Hanoi and the South Vietnamese Communists, formally endorsed the accords, marking the pinnacle of Nixon's Vietnam policy. By March, however, and in flagrant violation of the agreement, Hanoi once again began using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to infiltrate massive amounts of military equipment into South Vietnam. In early April 1973, Nixon decided on resuming an air attack on Hanoi's supply lines. It was planned for early April, when all American prisoners would have returned from North Vietnamese captivity. But then, in the middle of April, White House counsel John Dean began cooperating with federal prosecutors regarding allegations of his office's participation in wiretaps and other activities under investigation. This rapidly evolved into the scandal now known as Watergate. Under its impact, congressional reservations turned into wholesale proscriptions of military action in Indochina. The Vietnam Agreement had always depended on the willingness and ability to enforce its provisions. It was based on the assumptions that, during the 1972 North Vietnamese offensive, Saigon had demonstrated its ability to withstand North Vietnamese military capacities so long as it received the supplies allowed under the treaty, namely, one-for-one replacements, and that, in case of an all-out attack, American airpower would be available. Amidst the Watergate investigation, an exhausted public would not support additional conflict in Indochina. Congress cut off military aid to Cambodia altogether, condemning it to governance by the murderous Khmer Rouge, reduced economic and military assistance to South Vietnam by 50%, and prohibited all military action, in or over or from off the shores of North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos or Cambodia. In these circumstances, enforcement of the limitations of the Vietnam Agreement became impossible, and restraints on Hanoi